My name is Josep da Costa. I graduated in political science and international relationships at NOVA for social studies. And my question is, since we are in a global, how can I say, well, in a global struggle for democracy and because of this war, my question is, how are the relationships between the Atlantic North and the South of the Atlantic? Because every time that we talk about the transatlantic relations, we only refer to the North Atlantic. And right now, since the
South. Okay.
the NATO is spending more in their security because of the influence of China and Russia, particularly in the east of Europe and in Africa, how the countries in the North Atlantic can solve this problem by aligning themselves with the countries of the South of Atlantic, namely the countries in South America and in Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Bruno. O Bruno sente-se 30.
Yes, absolutely.
Que corresponde à minha condição física. Não, era comentário. Oh, sorry, switch English. A quick comment to Pedro. I strongly agree that some of the questions, for instance, on Ukraine, if you could ask things like, in the future, EU membership, even if it costs your country, if it has a negative impact on your country, or even in terms of NATO membership, I don't think you should ask, will this lead to war, even if this leads to war with Russia, but maybe even if this leads to more tensions with Russia, something like that, I think it would be a better test. I tend to disagree with the idea that Ukraine is not politicized or sufficiently debated. I think most of the other topics, yes. I think probably with Ukraine I would disagree with you, but you are the expert. And a specific question, which is on the US. Did you find any evidence of this polarization on some of these topics that we see a lot of talk about leading up to the election? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions, and I'm not an IR expert, so maybe I'll make a comment on Bruno's comment, but
I can go for the first one and you go for the other. Yeah.
So.
No, please.
No, my comment on Bruno. Yeah, I mean, we can split hairs on the degree of politicization of Ukraine. So the Communist Party currently has a vote intention of 4%. And if you look at almost all other single parties, their position in Ukraine is either silence, careful silence, or complete support. So this is what I mean by low politicization. It's particularly compared with contexts that we have in the countries that were also surveyed.
Yeah, maybe I take it over with the question on polarization in the US first. Yes, we find this gap. The gap is significant on almost all questions. There are 1 or 2 questions where we see very little variation. Some of the China questions, when you go in the tougher approach, there are a few items where Democrat-leaning and Republican-leaning respondents agree. But basically, on almost all other questions, it's safe to say that there is going to gap, and the gap is, like statistically speaking, often massive. So, for example, when we look at the support for Ukraine options, we often, or the support among Democrat-leaning respondents, be it for EU membership, NATO membership, or financial support, often amounts to 70 to 80%, regardless of the measures. And among the Republican-leaning respondents, it's more between 50 and 60. So it's much lower. We also see that, for example, when it comes to the perception of China's influence as negative, we see it on the questions on democracy, on climate change. It's everywhere. So it's very striking how you see this polarization in the US in the data. Maybe I also pick up on the question on the South Atlantic? Or did you want to take that one?
No, feel free.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, in fact, so maybe first one thing on this term of a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Even though this is a narrative or a wording that is often used by governments, we see that the public does not really subscribe to this narrative. Particularly when we see that there is a certain part of the public who says it doesn't matter whether my government or whether my country cooperates with democracies and autocracies. And maybe to give some examples from my work at GMF, where we also have people working on the Indo-Pacific, but also a program that is particularly focusing on, it's called GMF South, so Southern Atlantic mostly. And the feedback that we often get from colleagues is that for them, this term democracy versus autocracy, when they talk to people in Brazil, in Argentina, but also, for example, in Senegal, is that the narrative really poses a problem, because democracy and also autocracy has many shades, and it's not a black and white discussion. So this is one thing when it comes to framing the debate and framing the relationship with countries outside the Transatlantic Alliance that is extremely important. But more broadly, yes, we need to think transatlantic relations, of course, beyond NATO and beyond what was quite often, or for quite a long time, just Western Europe, Canada, and the US. There is no doubt about that. Because there are policy areas where interests align, and in these areas it is logical to enhance cooperation, because many of the transnational challenges that are also identified by a majority of the citizens in the countries that are being polled, like climate change and immigration, for example, but also war between countries or pandemics, these are challenges that need solutions that go beyond just the old transatlantic sphere, if we want to call it like that.
Good. I'll take the first question. There is no easy answer to that. By picking up an idea that Pedro was talking about, depoliticization, right? I would also argue that in the last decades, this is just a generalization. Of course, different countries with different resources and different strategic cultures function differently. But we have also witnessed a demilitarization of our societies, of the way we look at the world. And this war, in a very unfortunate way, has brought the issue back on the table. This is to say that the relationship between what we think the armed forces should do, what should be their goals, if it is an attractive career or not, all those issues, I think they grow, they're not new, and we have been trying to deal with them for quite some time. And that is just, it's not just a Portuguese problem or challenge. It also affects many other countries within the European Union. And there's also the second question of the trade-offs. If we want to meet the 2% that we agreed at Dublin, if we want to do that and actually invest in technologies, capabilities, if we want to do that because we don't have a great pool of resources, we have to make choices. And that also entails a very pedagogical way of talking and explaining, if we want to do this, we will have to cut this and that and that. And that is also, I think, a very tough conversation from a political point of view, from an electoral point of view. And the further we delay it, the greater the cost and the greater the issue at stake. So I think your question is really good. It's a structural issue that we will have to decide from a strategic but a political decision in order to do this. And I have this debate and these questions many times with my colleagues, with my students. I usually ask my students, who here is thinking of pursuing a military career? And the answer is a very small, if not zero number. And we have to question ourselves, why is this? And in other societies, the military career is definitely a career. It's an option. And all of that has costs. So I don't have an easy answer for you, but I think that's definitely another of the trade-offs, the important political discussions that we have been delaying or postponing throughout, I would say, since the end of the Cold War, to be very honest.
Maybe.
Gesine wanted to add something.
Yeah, maybe to quickly react to that, I just learned a lot on Portuguese, like on the role of the military. And as someone who is German, that reminds me pretty much on the debate that Germany has had until the country announced the Zeitenwende, this 100 billion euros fund for the military. And I think even though this debate is just starting, it also really shows how difficult these debates can be for a society. Because the current, in the end, it all comes down to money.
Yes.
And when you now see how the government in Germany is struggling to really invest this money while also respecting some budgetary criteria, you see that the far right in Germany extremely benefits from that.
Yeah.
So I think this is a painful debate and really a massive task for governments to explain to citizens that there is also an added value.
Yes.
I just wanted to add something on public opinion and defense spending. Defense spending is very difficult to sell to public opinion.
Yes.
Even in the US, if Americans had an idea about how much the US spends on defense, they would be horrified. One of the reasons why they are not completely horrified is because defense spending creates a lot of jobs.
Yes.
That in the US, that members of Congress, of course, like to be able to show to their constituents. But defense spending is always very difficult. If an imminent threat is not present, if we live in a country like Portugal, where you can always say, well, we are not that big of a country, somebody is going to take care of this, it's difficult to persuade people. And I mean, we've been living for the last 10 years, the government has cut funding on education, has cut funding on science. The idea that it would increase spending on defense, I think, would create a lot of problems. So more questions? Yes, 1, 2, so 3. So I saw 3 people. Please go ahead. You in the second row. I think you need the mic.
So the defense spending question got me curious because, well, first of all, in the US, I think a lot of it depends on whether Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Shield AI now are in your district. Because then you probably have very favorable public opinion because you're bringing in a lot of economic value. But it also brought up a question with regards to what Professor Vaz Pinto was saying earlier about the question of autonomy versus partnership and whether those are really at odds with each other or if they can be reconciled. Because one of the questions with NATO is also the defense spending of the countries, and defense spending ipso facto would probably also raise the autonomy of the countries that are spending more. So, the reason I bring this up is because I recently read an interesting paper about the idea of strategic interdependence, which would create more autonomy while also creating more partnership.
Within NATO?
Within NATO, as well as within the EU, so that they're not, and it kind of goes back to this idea, I think, that was also talked about, that Atlanticism and Europhiles aren't necessarily at each other's throats either.
Okay.
So, you in the back? Yes, 4th row.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. A quick question on the state of democracy. I was looking at the data at page 63, and I have a quick question on the deficit of the perceived democracy in Portugal. So it's, from the data shown, it's the country where democracy apparently most degraded. And I'm curious to understand what's the root causes behind this data. And if you could share with us a bit more on why is this happening, particularly when Portugal, from all the 14 countries assessed, is probably the country with the longest running government and stability. So very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
That's definitely for you, Pedro.
There was, yes.
Hello. Hello, good evening. My name is Daniel. I'm a student of the Masters in International Studies at ICS-UL. Your presentation and report was very interesting. It raised a lot of questions. Maybe my main question would be, how dependent are these perceptions of the US on the administration of the party of the administration in the White House in the United States? Because I remember seeing some graphs when it changed from Trump to Biden, there was big shifts in opinions of the US role, if it's positive or negative in international system. So my question would be, how much do you think that factors in? And it would be interesting an answer related to many countries in general, but specifically Portugal. How strong is this transatlantism, and how independent it is from the president, from the party of the president? And my other question related to this is, if the relationship with China gets worse because there's an invasion of Taiwan or something else, or maybe there's a president of the United States that focuses more on China and is less worried about Russia and Ukraine, if depends a lot on the next election, how much would Europe and Portugal also follow that trend against China? That right now it seems Portugal is relatively positive regarding China, and maybe I don't know if it will continue, or it would be a very fast shift if things get tougher.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, we have 3 questions. I don't know who wants to start.
Gesine, you go for the
Which?
administrations,
Okay.
presidents.
Yes.
Good?
Sure.
Yeah?
Sure, let's do that. So unfortunately, we didn't have the question on the feeling about the US influence in 2021. But what we see is that there was a real, what we call the Biden bump from 2020 to 2021 when it comes to the support for, or the willingness to see the US involved in European security. So in some countries, like Germany and France, we saw that leap up by more than 10 points without having a war, without having a concrete a security threat that was very imminent from 2020 to 2021. And then we saw another jump from 2021 to 2022, which for us was a bit the war or Ukraine jump. But when we look at the averages, it's interesting that both with regard to the importance of NATO, but also with regard to the willingness of US involvement in European security and defense, the big jump was from 2020 to 2021. So from a data perspective, you can say it does matter. But on the other hand, the administration in the White House does not influence how powerful or how influential the US are seen, because we see really a perfect continuity of these values. So it's between 62 and 64% of people who say the US are the most influential actor in global affairs. From a statistical perspective, that's perfect continuity.
Okay, so I wanted to, just 3 things. I wanted to add something to what Gesine said. I seem to remember, we probably know these data better. In the beginning of the Transatlantic Trends, I seem to remember a very obvious pattern. The approval of the US's actions on foreign policy. And you could see a huge difference then from Bush to Obama, and then to Obama to Trump, and now from Trump to... So it's very correlated with in Europe, at least in Portugal, but I think in most of Europe, between Democrats and Republicans. The second comment I wanted to make, I want to go back to the defense spending issue. Sure, defense spending is much, much easier to sell if you are creating jobs and you are making the economy better in your district. But there's a very nice late 1990s paper, that I think the results have been replicated. And it's very interesting because it has to do with the trade-offs that we talked about before. So they pose Americans before 4 goals: increase defense spending, increase social spending, decrease taxes, reduce the deficit. And when you start asking people, so would you agree with increasing taxes to increase defense spending? Or would you agree increasing the deficit to increase defense spending? When you combine all these dilemmas, it turns out that most Americans, when they are faced with these dilemmas, I don't want to change anything. The only thing that they want to change is defense spending. They want less of it, even if it means. So the dilemma between defense spending and reducing the deficit and taxes and in everything else, when they are faced with this dilemma, they don't want to change anything except for defense spending. But so it's the only item in the budget, I think, where when you place things in these zero-sum terms, people tend to be more inclined to reduce defense spending. But that's probably also a function of the fact that most people, or a lot of people, live in states that don't necessarily benefit from this defense spending. So the third thing is the state of democracy issue. So it's not exactly the same variable, but there's one question that has been exhaustively studied. It's just how satisfied are you with the way democracy works in your country? And what drives this? So one thing that drives this is corruption, is the perception of corruption. But this does not explain the change, because in Portugal, everybody thinks that all politicians are corrupt all the time. So it doesn't explain change. It's a constant thing. If you look at Eurobarometer, 90% of the people say corruption prevails in Portugal. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not debating this. So the change needs to come from other source. The main source that, all studies tend to show is the main driver of satisfaction with democracy is the perception of the state of the economy. So when the economy is perceived to get worse, people get less satisfied with the way democracy works. So that's one thing that changes and seems to be very much behind this change. The other thing is political polarization, right? So the more distant parties are from each other, or the more antagonistic is political discourse and the political style, this tends to decrease people's satisfaction with democracy. And what explains this particular case of Portugal? I think the last year, of course, nobody will be surprised, has been very, very difficult for a lot of people from a financial, economic point of view. And then one might argue that polarization is increasing. But I'm not trying to explain why we get this figure. I'm talking about variables that tend to drive this, and in Portugal seem to move in a direction that decrease people's satisfaction with democracy. Is this the cause? I don't know. It's just, but there's an association there, perhaps.
And I'll take the other two questions. First of all, I would really like to read your paper, and I think that's it. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but I think that there are a lot of hurdles to be crossed. It's not your paper, but whoever wrote the paper, I'll be happy to read it. I think that it is a truism, but it has to be stated. The EU is not a state. And because it's not a state, a lot of issues arise from the levels of autonomy, the differences of strategic cultures within certain states, the perception of what is a threat is quite different as well. So I think that would involve a lot of political, economic work to be done. It's quite different with the US, despite the administration, to make the strategic choices. What you really have to take into account is you have to, between inverted commas, control or win elections and have the Congress with you. So I would be skeptical, but I would love to read the paper. For the second question on China, it's actually a very mixed photograph that we have of our relationship with China. And when we start to deepen the issues and the trade-offs, it's much more challenging from that point of view. The question on Taiwan, I think that it also helps that we are talking about a scenario. I think it's something completely different if in the case of an invasion, you would see images on your television screens of people with an American flag and people just actually asking the US to intervene, and that would of course have an impact. Also, I think that because we are now unfortunately dealing with a war in Europe, I think that even unconsciously we look at this question and we think, no, we do not want to have another issue. But for the United States, is definitely an issue. The United States, if something like that happens regarding Taiwan, the United States will be in a very, very hot spot because it will have the issue of credibility, it would have the issue of deterrence, and it would have all its strategic allies in the Indo-Pacific screaming about the US leadership on this particular case. I think that question to an American public or to an American leadership, and in that regard, I think that I don't have an answer for you. I don't know if we are going to follow or we are going to align, but I think that we also have here an opportunity to actually develop a more European alternative. I'm not saying as against, but in a way that it complements, it adds value to the United States. And I think that's something that even at the Commission level, the idea of strategic commission, the idea of looking, for instance, at critical raw materials that we hugely depend on from China and many other countries, and act on that with the calendar, with at least looking at this deglobalization in a much more rational and strategic way. So I think there are steps, and I think that unfortunately, because it's a war, the pandemics and the war have accelerated that process, but we are still way far from that. So it's not a very, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's something that I think that all US presidents pray in the Oval Room thinking, please let not this happen, because I really would have to make a very tough decision.
Maybe, can I
Yes,
add something?
please.
I mean, this question on how Europeans would react to China also to some extent relates to that other question that we had between autonomy and partnership. Because this is like if we increase defense spending, does that go into autonomy or does that go into partnership? And this is also precisely the question that Europeans are seeing with like transatlantic burden sharing, but also with regard to China.
Yes.
And I would say this is precisely the case where we see that autonomy or a stronger alternative approach or your own approach or just stronger capacities and answers and strategies, be it on a European level or on a national level, are not at all exclusive to being a good partner. I would even say that they are the absolutely central condition for being a good partner. Because when we think, for example, about the Indo-Pacific scenario, when I exchange with colleagues from the US or people who are really following the US debates, sometimes I hear sentences like, honestly, at the moment, Europeans, there is no interest to have you in the Indo-Pacific with military capacities because the US will need its capacities to protect Europeans there.
Yes.
And that is, I think, really the thing that we have to think about when we are discussing these defense and autonomy and strength capacity building or capability building processes. It's not about building autonomy from something, but rather autonomy for something, and for autonomy for being able to act.
To deliver.
I Maybe last round of questions? Yes, so the last round of questions. Please. Maybe, I think they are recording.
Here, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and discussion afterwards, and of course the huge work that has been done before. So this has been very, very interesting afternoon. My name is Monika. I'm ambassador of Estonia, and I would like to ask about two key findings. One of them, Canada, Germany, and Sweden are the most reliable countries in public opinion. How do you comment on that? Why is this this way? And of course, I'm also very much interested in the finding that the young respondents hold more positive views than their elders about Russia and its influence in the world. And how do you comment on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening. Antonio Martins da Costa, American Chamber of Commerce. I was just reading the report. It's a fantastic source of information. And there are three things that surprised me. One of them was already discussed, this drop in the perception of the state of democracy, especially Portugal, that has a drop of 15 points, which is the highest in every country. You already comment on that. But also, if you go to the perception of what the government is doing to tackle climate change, you see that Portugal is not very well positioned, to say the least.
Skeptic.
7% favorable regarding 15% in Europe. And if there is a country that has been doing a lot in terms of renewable energy and this climate change, Portugal, I'm sure that it's in the lead. So, but the perception is not that perception. So, combining these two results, the drop in democracy, state of democracy, and the perception on the climate is being tackled by the government, is there a role that media is playing on, let's say, increasing the level of polarization regarding, for example, these two points of view, especially social media that is being very active on these topics? And the last question that is what was also a surprise is when I see on page 65 addressing global challenges, if the country should cooperate only with democracies or not. I was surprised to see Turkey in the first place, as people are discussing about the democracy in Turkey, being more liberal, not so liberal. I was surprised. If you'd like to make a comment on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Any last question?
On the back,
There
I
in the
think.
back. And this is the very last one, I'm sorry.
Good night, thank you. I'm Eduardo from University of Lisbon. I'm a researcher there. My question is about if you talked about if the people they know. Let me get to the first question, then I get to this. The first one is about the 24th part of democracy, prosperity, and stability. Pedro talked about the influence of economy to people agree or not with democracy, and I would like to know if you correlated this data to know if prosperity and stability, how much people that gave 9 or 10 to democracy would lean on doing it also on prosperity and stability. And I would like to know also about if people, I forgot the word, sorry.
Say in Portuguese.
Okay, let me remember it also now.
Okay,
I forgot
sorry.
it.
I was trying to help just now, I'm sorry.
If the credibility of the news and also of the institutions with the people, because I don't know if you have something that changed along the time and that influences, for example, how they see the democracy, or for example here the prosperity and the stability. So I'd like to know about the institutions and news, and of course, as the colleague said about that, about the social media also. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a diverse set of questions.
We do.
Gesine, you want to start?
Yes, I'm happy to start with a few of the questions. Maybe I'd start with the question on Turkey. Why does Turkey rank so high when it comes to the willingness to cooperate with democracy? We also see that the value or that the number of people who say that democracy is in a good state in Turkey has significantly increased, and that the shares of respondents who rate democracy as a 9 or a 10 is highest in Turkey. And I discussed that a lot with colleagues in Ankara, and they told us honestly, Turkey was just coming out of the elections. So we made already an effort to space it out a bit. Last round of Turkish elections was on 28th May. We started the fieldwork 2 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, on 15th June. So basically, what my colleagues tell me, who are working on with a lot of Turkish people and follow the debate, which I don't do because of lack of language skills, is that for many people in Turkey, the very definition of democracy is really this procedural aspect of democracy, this idea that you go to cast your ballot. And based on this, of course, there were irregularities, we know that. But when you ask people after the elections whether they were happy with the process, many of them really saw that as an important part of Turkish democracy and of living democracy in Turkey. So I would say that this is a bit part of this post-election enthusiasm about Turkish democracy. Maybe I also respond really to the methodological part of this question, whether we did cross-correlations between how people rated the different aspects. We did not, because it's not a rating. No, it's not a ranking, it's a rating. So we ask for each item separately whether people think it's important, and that was deliberately done because we do not think, I mean, of course it's nice to have the trade-off because then you force people a bit out of their comfort zone, but we really wanted to see whether there are striking differences. But actually there are not. So we really see that if in a country one value is ranked high, and that's for example what we see in Turkey, if people are very likely to give a high rating to one of the things, they also give a very high rating to the other. So that's what we see in many cases. But apparently it's also very much a cultural issue, because when I discussed that with people from the Netherlands, they tell me honestly, if people from the Netherlands give you a 9 or a 10, for them it's extreme. If they give you a 7 or an 8, that's a lot. So that's why we decided not to do that. I can also respond on reliability, but maybe I'll hand that over to you for a second and then take that over again.
Do you know why Canada, Germany, and Sweden are seen as so reliable or more reliable on average?
I mean, for Sweden and Canada, I'm not an expert on either, but what I see in the data is that these numbers have not changed or barely changed since 2021. They are very stable. Honestly, following the German debate and all the hesitation that we have seen from the German government, for example, when it came to providing tanks for Ukraine, and so on, when it comes to the debates on energy that are being held in the EU, I was actually very surprised that it hadn't changed.